Hello, welcome to today's video, where it's just taking a look at various ETFs that exist. Why? Because why not? A lot of these videos I've done have mainly focused on specific companies or areas, such as that wonderful UBS private credit primer. And so I figured, why not, be a bit more actionable potentially, and just take a look at the many ETFs that exist out there, specifically from the big three, of course, famous asset managers that are out there, of course, who are the beneficial owners of the shares, and of course, which kind of pokes some holes in the more conspiracy-minded things. And this won't be super long video, just a short thing to test out a new mic. But at the end of the day, right, having an equity bias is a good thing, probably, right? Equity bias rate probably beats cash bias or fixed income bias, of course, assuming you have long enough time duration and are sufficiently diversified, which an ETF generally fits, right? It's actively it's rebalancing, right? Holdings move in and out depending on whatever criteria for the underlying provider, which helps create, uh, helps you capture that right tail and the mid tail, and eventually at some point lose the left tail, right? Because ultimately the left tail is where the permanent capital impairment can occur, and functionally, conceptually, as long as you don't have permanent capital impairment, things generally work out. It might not be alpha, but again, right? So much of investing is more so just staying in the game and not being knocked out. And so ETFs, whether it's a mutual fund or whatever other, even if it's like a privately listed investment vehicle, right? Like, generally speaking, as long as it has the equity bias, it probably works out fairly. And so again, let's go through a list. And again, right, to the degree to which costs are a thing. Of course, the costs, they're not readily visible to you, right? It just comes straight out the NAV, which affects the pricing of the ETF, like the actual ETF NAV. And of course, the nice structure of ETFs is that if you're a sophisticated counterparty, you can functionally exchange the underlying for shares, and that's how ETF prices track pretty closely to the NAV, which makes the two a meaningful proxy for each other, as well as the fact that, especially if it's a publicly listed equities ETF, right? Like the NAV you can trust, right? Because the market on business days is telling you exactly what the underlying is worth. It's not like it's like the NAV for that one listed vehicle that has stakes in private companies, right? So who knows? Oh, seriously, you can take the NAV for that fund. I forget what it's called, but like Matt Levine's read about it. But so it's not like expense ratios, like they do matter because it is ultimately a drag on your NAV, drag on your implied return, and to the prior point of ideally having equity bias for the long term, that can help you know correspondingly having a long-term drag from an expense ratio perspective. It's a necessary evil. Presumably you maybe own direct exposure into whether it's the asset managers themselves or MSCI, or like who for some of these guys is the underlying index provider. Of course, in many other cases, it's like Morningstar or something, and that's probably how, right, states, people have different underlying indexes, which is how they get uh, lower lower expense ratios, just given different pricing. Uh, and all I have to say is that expense ratio, it's not everything, right? Same way, like tax avoidance shouldn't be everything. And if it's it's time to sell something. It's time to sell, and you shouldn't let not wanting to pay taxes prevent a sufficiently good decision. But again, it's something to be considered, right? And so, like, if it's day 364, maybe you can wait till day 366 for long-term capital gains, right? So it's that similar thinking. And again, at the end of the day, right, there is a big difference between 2 basis points of expense ratios versus uh, paying 70 basis points, 70 bips to one of these guys. And again, right, sometimes these might be warranted, right? Like if it's S&P China ETF, they're probably, I imagine it's the underlying is A shares, yeah, A shares uh, listed in China. And if you go on Interactive Brokers website, like you can see that what the transaction fees are if you want to own A shares or Hong Kong listed shares, right? So again, it's agree, but even in the Blackstone case, right? Like, it is being actively managed. It is fixed income, presumably like some privately listed fixed income underlying, right? So some of these are warranted. But again, you can kind of see where the AUM is as an indicator of where market interest is. So taking a look at, and again, like State Street, iShares through BlackRock, Vanguard, and then I highlighted BNY Mellon because of this pleasant zero expense ratio one. But starting with State Street, personally, State Street's probably the one I have the most underlying economic. Well, that's not necessarily true for retirement exposure, but I think State Street's S&P proxy at 2 bips. I think that is differentiated, I would say, right? Compared to Vanguard's 3 bips. And BlackRock's is also 3 bips. I believe State Street came in last fall. I believe like October in 2023. And they adjusted the fee structure to 2 bips. And that's when I learned about that offering, and certainly personally allocated to that. And here, all right, 3 bips. Something to note. I'm fairly certain if we go to iShares, because iShares is a big MSCI shop. If we look at the underlying, I guess the underlying is the S&P, because for some guys they might have like a separate S&P index to not have to pay S&P, SPGI, S&P Global, whatever the licensing fee is, right? But generally speaking, iShares is pretty big, like Morningstar or MSCI stuff, right? But you can kind of see like the MSI, like ACWI, like ETH stuff. Yeah, but State Street, right? You have S&P. It's gonna focus on equity stuff, just to fit within the mold of having equity buys is a good thing, right? You're right. Again, like at 2-3 bips, right? Like that's kind of like the lower limit where your expense ratio can go, which again is perfectly fine. Where generally speaking is reasonable, right? But right, S&P, right, large cap bias, small cap bias. If you want your high beta, you know, of course the quirk is right. This is the S&P 600, which is different than from say like the Russell 2000, which does have a fairly meaningful difference. While they're both nominally small cap, there are pretty big differences in the actual underlying average quality of the underlying holdings from over like a qualitative perspective if you go through the listings, but also just from a quantitative like debt and leverage profile, or like a leverage profile. Excuse me, that was redundant. And like return on like invested capital tends to be better in the S&P 600, S&P mid cap, total stock index. Personally, always been a bit conflicted about like conceptually, like a total stock market index, because if it's all market weighted, right, then you're naturally like you're gonna get, if it's all market weighted, you're in that all stock market index, like you're still gonna get uh, that strong large cap bias probably. If we go to holdings, right, like you're getting the same Apple, Microsoft, Nvidia, all of that good stuff. Go to S&P 500, which presumably is a proxy, right? Like you're getting less exposure, generally speaking. So, so the actual case might not actually bear it out, but conceptually there is a, like again, like, it was like functional, right? Like you are like diversifying, and like functionally speaking, like once you're past 20 holdings, right, you've kind of diversified your idiosyncratic risk. So then everything's systemic. So it's not so much diversification for risk, although I suppose that is what I've been saying has been very biased with like that large cap strength always outperforming. But again, right, but if you want to capture, like maybe small caps can outperform in whatever market condition, then you can just own the underlying small cap, right? And so the thinking I've debated is like I can just, is like, is an all stock index, total market index, additive to holding S&P small cap, mid cap individually? Because ultimately, right, my overall exposure, which is what the all market index is giving me, is functionally the same. Um, yeah, my conclusion is, well, in general, it's probably better just have uh, get over whatever mental blocks and just allocate capital to equities. And so just having another line item helps with uh, that mental process. But curious for thoughts. But again, at the end of the day, right, like I'm fairly certain from like a yield perspective. Oh yeah, yield perspective is probably less than say the S&P 500. But again, right, like you're paying 3 bips for something that's going to give you functionally the average of these three. I suppose that's it, right? Just functionally speaking, the more holdings you have, right, the bigger your N is, the more likely you're going to have whatever is the average. Uh, and given that these are index funds, that's not something we should be worried about. By definition, right, we're perfectly happy with average, perfectly happy with beta of 1. Uh, so, yeah. Either way, and presumably whatever actual meaningful long-term difference there is out there, uh, presume again like over a 40-year time horizon, and you compound, X Y Z at whatever rate you want to use, uh, then it's kind of immaterial, or not immaterial, because it's presumably the dollar values will be meaningful, but you get to the same destination. You have S&P quirky ones, right? Value growth. If we see what's in the value, yeah, right. You don't have those tech names, which is of course kind of what you would have, at least up until now, wish you would have had. Um, so, and then growth is probably those tech names. Dividend ETFs, 6 million. This is a I haven't noticed this one. This must be a really recent launch. 6 million. Yeah, it must be a new. This must be a new launch because I did not notice this one. We're gonna have some dividend options, right? And again, right, then you have more of a tax drag consideration. Of course, in general, right, ETFs are more tax efficient from like the capital gains distributions perspective. But of course, have a wrinkle rate to consider, you know, what vehicle you're gonna have them in. Europe, emerging markets, developed world. sector specific. Of course, SPY. If you want to buy, uh, which is the underlying for many S&P options, climate, like thematic. Yeah, and starts to right as the expense ratio starts going up, like it starts to be how much. Honestly, again, right, like the information is publicly available. Or you can look at the holdings. Like, you can download the Excel if you want to see the full list, and then just go through like the Excel and just do some research on some underlying holdings, right? So honestly, like these ETFs or the underlying indexes are decent like top of funnels for doing individual research. Um, but again, right, like consumption, if you're going to buy a sector ETF, like you are making an active management decision for something that is supposed to be passive management. Uh, and again, right, like your opportunity cost rate is like 32 bips from D sector uh, to what you could be getting. And again, right, ignoring like the U.S. bias, right, just do a mix of emerging markets and developed, right, function like your EFI, right, and you're kind of good. So there's some State Street things, right? Just look up State Street, SPDR, ETFs. You can find a list like this. Because at the end of the day, right? Like again, right? Like it makes sense for these asset managers, right? Like they want it to be a pleasant user experience, so it's uh, pretty accessible. Move on to BlackRock. Maybe you can rate who has the best user interface, and maybe that's a signal. So BlackRock, all right, total stock market. Again, S&P, growth, value growth, developed markets, mid cap, small cap stuff. I guess conceptually after jump, you kind of see that State Street has lower expense options. It's something that stands out. Uh, Dividend stuff. If we keep on scrolling, generally speaking, I'd say iShares has a lot more offerings, many more offerings, right? 440 offerings, um, which generally tend to be, I would say, as we get deeper into bench, the difference tends to be with like country stuff, right? Uh, just given an MSCI connection. Although the funny thing is, when you look at some of these country ETFs, that for some of them, like there just isn't that many holdings, aren't that many holdings. Right, only six. Uh, 1, 2, 3, like 54. I think there's a ETF for them, but like there was Hungary, MSCI Hungary's index has only 3 holdings. So it's but that's iShares, right? I guess conceptually like iShares. These yes, some big ones, right? You can see, right, like just the asset size of these funds are bigger than certainly these low cost ones. Because State Street's big thing is SPY, and that's more so because of its how liquid it is. Yeah, so certainly State Street, I'd say generally trumps iShares for low cost options. Of course, if you want a deeper bench, right, and 888 offerings versus 443 or 86 for Vanguard. And look at Vanguard again here, right? Similar, or excuse me, even fewer for Vanguard because I didn't filter out the bond ETFs, so it's only 50. And so we see here, right? Again, like Vanguard, right? Not as deep a bench of low cost products. But again, we see the same things, right? S&P, total market, and growth, large, mid, small, dividend, international, mega cap growth. This one's a bit interesting. If you want direct exposure to some of those like big tech names, right? You're kind of what? So like your Magnificent 7, 13, 25, 36, 40, 50, right? So basically 50, half your exposure is those guys. So if you want that exposure, like it's here. And again, maybe like your job prevents you from like owning directly or stuff and stuff, right? So it's a way to get backdoor way to express a view. So yeah, these are just some ETFs. Nothing too complicated. Not making any. Certainly not making. Oh, excuse me. And BNY. So there's always, of course, those are the big three. Although there's players like Invesco, Schwab, Fidelity have more specific products. Like Janus Henderson, Capital Group have more niche products, but John speaking right, like asset management, like out of like economies of scale, it's probably an overused term or used inaccurately. But I would say in the asset management business, um, economies of scale are certainly real, just given the fixed costs and like back office functionality you see, uh, and all of that. So generally speaking, like once you move outside the big three, it's pretty tough to be competitive against the big three when it comes to pricing. Uh, but you can always find unique offerings. And for BNY Mellon, a big bank that has a wide range of services from custodial stuff to the asset management side. They have BKLC, which is a nice zero expense ratio fund. Of course, who knows how long it'll be zero, given it's 2.4 billion, which isn't necessarily massive compared to some of the alternatives that are out there. But just to highlight like the index differences, right? Like here, the index is like selective Morningstar, right? It's not like an S&P thing or MSCI thing, which gets like the data providers being different. So this is one that stands out, right? I forget how I came across it. It's doing some googling on stuff. So um, yeah. So as a general speaking, right, like State Street, iShares, Vanguard are certainly the big three. If you just look at like top asset managers by assets. But as a general speaking, like it does seem from a cursory review that State Street has a deeper offering of low cost vehicles. But of course, then these are certainly probably more established, maybe more name brand or whatever. But again, in general, right, large having equity bias is a good thing. So there's a quick look. So that's yeah. But yeah, at the end of the day, right, equity bias can't hurt. Oh, I suppose if there's a significant drawdown and permanent impairment, it would hurt. So I won't jinx it. I knew La Mufa, but nonetheless, yeah, these things are all pretty easily accessible online. And if I'm a better person, I will link to them in the description, but no promises.